With this new camera, Panasonic is looking to deal a serious blow to the likes of Sony, Canon, and Nikon in the world of high-resolution hybrid cameras. In fact, the company is so confident about this new release, they've even called it their best hybrid mirrorless camera ever. So what is it, and is it really as good as they claim? Well, this is the Panasonic Lumix S1RII Mark II, and it's the long-awaited successor to 2019's S1R. Now, I was lucky enough to get my hands on this pre-production copy at this year's Lumix Summit event in Tromsø, Norway. Though, before anyone starts to get undone, let me be clear about one thing. Panasonic has not paid me to make this video, and no one from Panasonic has ever told me what I can or can't say about this camera or any other product. Despite me going on the trip, I was not contractually obliged to make any content about this product, though of course they were kind enough to cover some of my expenses like flights, accommodation and food whilst I was at the event, and that was just to make it financially viable for me to even go. Panasonic also took myself and other guests on a few excursions whilst we were in Tromsø so that we could try out the camera in a real-world setting, and this camera that they've given me is a pre-production sample, as it clearly says on the bottom of the camera here, so it's not fit for resale. So I'm very much treating this as a long-term loan, and once I'm done with it, it will be returned to them. So now that you have all of the facts, if any of what I've just said makes me seem untrustworthy to you in any way, shape or form, feel free to click away. But if you are still here, let's just cut to the chase and talk about what changes have been made to this new version. Now, in terms of style, size and weight, this is very similar to the S5 Mark II, including the same built-in air cooling system, the same battery type, and a similar level of weather sealing. Though the key difference is that this S1R Mark II is not only dust and splash resistant, but it's also freeze resistant down to temperatures as low as -10 degrees Celsius or 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The rear monitor also appears to be the same 1840K dot resolution screen as the S5 Mark II, though this one has both the tilty flippy action and it can also have a free angle thing going on, which, you know, is a plus. Now on the top here, there's a large 5760K dot OLED EVF with a 0.78 times magnification, and whilst this isn't quite as high spec as the one found on the Sony A7R Mark V, it is at least in line with the Canon R5 Mark II and slightly better than the one on the Nikon Z8. Now sticking to the top plate, this layout has received a fairly major reshuffle too, for the better in my opinion. The old top plate display has been completely removed to make way for the mode dial with an on-off switch neatly collared around it. The front command dial now sits around the shutter button, which makes it way easier to reach with your index finger, and the rear dial has also been moved back slightly to help prevent it from being knocked by accident, which apparently was a common complaint with the Mark I. Now on the opposite side of the EVF, there's now a dial for changing the drive mode, but more importantly, collared around this dial is a dedicated switch for toggling between photo, video and S&Q modes. The mode dial has made space for 5 custom modes, and the 5th option can even be further expanded using the settings menu to have up to 10 different save states. But it actually goes one step further than that, because now all of these custom settings are actually locked specifically to the photo, video and S&Q modes. In other words, you now get up to 14 custom modes for photo, 14 for video and 14 dedicated to S&Q, which is a slightly maniacal level of customization.
And if you can't handle it, you can just, you know, f*** off.
Anyway, on the side, they've made space for a single CF Express Type B card and a standard SD card slot, and then flip the camera over and you'll find a mic port, a headphone port, USB-C connection for charging and data transfer, and finally a full-size HDMI. Oh, and I also like that they've actually given each of these their own dedicated little rubber cubby hole, rather than, you know, one big flappy one that just gets in the way. But anyway, that's all very exciting, but arguably what's more impressive is the improved 5-axis IBIS system, because this camera now offers up to 8 stops of image stabilization without any kind of crop. Now, I actually got to test this out firsthand on a boat cruise through a fjord, and not only was the water a little bit choppy, but it was also super windy too. And as you can see from this example, shooting with a 70mm lens without the IBIS enabled means that the footage looks like it was shot by Michael J. Fox in a trampoline park. But once you switch on all of the IBIS settings, the results look almost as if they were captured from a tripod. So what about the improvements made to the photography side of things? Well, inside, this thing packs in a brand new 44.3 megapixel full frame sensor, which means it's actually slightly less resolution than the previous S1R Mark I model, model because that had a 47.3 megapixel chip. But honestly, 44 megapixels is still plenty enough for most cases. But either way, there's still no avoiding the fact that this megapixel count is still quite a bit less than the 61 megapixel sensor found on the Sony A7R Mark V. And whilst on paper it's more or less on par with the likes of the R5 Mark II and Nikon Z8, those include stack sensors, and this sensor is not stacked.
Did you get your tickets? To what? The gun show?
But I kind of think that makes sense because, as you'll see a little bit later on when we get onto talking about pricing, Panasonic is clearly going for the strategy of undercutting the competition, and having a stacked sensor would be much less cost efficient. But being frugal does not mean that this camera isn't filled with innovations. For example, they have introduced a fancy new carbon fiber shutter! And Panasonic are saying that this thing is good for around 400,000 actuations, which is actually pretty reassuring. Hey Sony, no, we haven't forgotten. But somewhat hilariously, the thing about this new shutter that the majority of people on the trip got most excited about was the fact that this can now be set to cover the sensor whilst the camera is switched off, as you can see. Now, the benefit of this is of course that it helps to shield the sensor from dust when switching lenses, though as most of you will probably know, this idea isn't anything new in the world of mirrorless cameras. In fact, Sony, Canon and Nikon have all provided this feature in most of their cameras for the last 4 to 5 years now, but better late than never, I guess. Anyway, besides being a barricade for dust bunnies, this new mechanical shutter can also capture images up to 10 frames per second in continuous burst mode. Or if you're happy to switch over to just the electronic shutter, then this can be jacked up to a pretty staggering 40 frames per second, which is blackout free as well. With a CF Express Type B card inserted, this allowed me to capture around 90 full res raw images before the buffer was filled. Or switching over to 40 frames per second, I could capture around 70 shots. Luckily, the raw files that I captured were actually compatible in Lightroom right away, which is actually kind of rare for new camera releases. Usually we have to wait a little while for things to update. But at least this meant that I could actually fully edit the raw files and see what they were capable of. And I wasn't disappointed. From experience, I think that the Panasonic color science is actually a pretty good base to work from, with nice natural colors straight out of the camera. They're also pretty flexible too. With lots of snow and fog around, it can actually make it quite tough to capture details in both the shadows and the highlights without some kind of manipulation. Luckily, I was able to pull back lots of lost detail with relative ease. And even with painfully underexposed images like this, I was able to drag back the detail from this seemingly unrecoverable shot using just the exposure slider. And given how hard I had to push this raw file, personally, I think the noise levels were pretty acceptable. I mean, back in the day, doing this to a raw file would just result in a total pile of mush. Also, on a side note, this video doesn't have a sponsor, but if you would like to help support what I do, then I do have some Lightroom presets for sale on my website, including this brand new one that I developed specifically for these photos from Norway, appropriately named Tromsø. And because you look particularly dashing today, if you use the discount code on screen now, you will receive 20% off your purchase. But anyway, now we're on to the big one, video. And I'm warning you, you might need to buckle up for this one because we've got a lot of ground to cover. Buckle up, buckaroo! So let's start with some of the physical additions that they've made specifically for video, because there's now front and rear tally lamps to let you know when the camera is recording, which is nice. They've also added a dedicated record button not only to the top plate here, but also a secondary one on the front. Now, I've been told that this has been added to allow you to hit record more easily with your left hand for those times where you're doing something else with your right hand, like having a wank, I'm assuming. What, just me? Okay.
There was a ghost! There's ectoplasm!
But anyway, I actually found this button to be incredibly annoying because within 5 minutes of shooting with this camera, I had already pressed it by accident numerous times, creating a lovely catalogue of videos of my feet. But the good news is that this button can quite easily be disabled within the settings menu. Now, whilst we're in the settings menu, let's take a look at the video capture options. And as you can see, this bad boy tops out at 8.1K 10-bit up to 30 frames per per second. But there's more, because Panasonic also told us that with a free firmware update coming later in 2025, this camera will be able to record both 8.1K and 7.2K OpenGate. Now, if you're not familiar with OpenGate, essentially it allows you to capture video using the entirety of the sensor, resulting in footage that adopts a more square-looking 3:2 aspect ratio, but making it much easier to repurpose the footage for both horizontal and vertical videos. But if your creaky old PC can barely handle 4K footage, let alone 8K, then don't worry, because using the dual card slots, you can also record proxy files to the SD card, which should hopefully take some of the heavy lifting out of the post-processing side of things. Now, in terms of 4K capture, this tops out at 4K 10-bit up to 120 frames per second, without a crop, though the autofocus is restricted to contrast detect only, unfortunately, until you bring it down to 60 frames per second or slower. But I'll take that. Finally, and this is kind of a big deal, this can capture 5.8K Apple ProRes RAW footage internally. That's right, there's no need to use an external recorder, so long as you're using one of the CF Express Type B cards. Now, all of that is obviously great, but there is one fairly obvious downside to demanding all of these impressive specs from a standard CMOS sensor, and that's the read speeds are gonna suffer. 8K is obviously the worst offender, but even when capturing 4K at higher frame rates, you are going to want to keep your whip pans to a minimum to avoid your footage looking like a bowl full of jelly. But the real thing that I wanted to find out was how long can this record 8K footage for before it becomes, you know, a fire risk? Well, I actually managed to get just over 50 minutes of recording before actually the battery died and put an end to things, though I did notice that the heat warning symbol started flashing around the 40-minute mark. I should also mention that this was tested at room temperature with the screen flipped out and the standard fan cooling settings, so results may vary in other circumstances. Anyway, moving on to picture profiles now, and there is of course the option of Vlog, and this provides 14 stops of dynamic range. There's also a new Cine-like A2 option, which was hinted by some on the trip that the A could be a nod towards the fact that this mode emulates ARRI color science. Real-time LUTs have made a comeback, and if you didn't know what they are, then this is a feature that allows you to upload your own custom-made LUTs onto the camera and apply them directly to both your video and photos in camera, with the intention of cutting out, you know, editing time in post-production afterwards. A whole bunch of visual aids have also been added, including frame markers and false color, and there's now a shutter speed limiter setting that allows you to set a minimum limit for the shutter speed to help it keep above the video frame rate. Oh, and there's of course dual native ISO, which helps to control noise more effectively when shooting in low light situations. Now, in terms of audio, they've also added 32-bit float when this camera is used alongside the Panasonic XLR2 mic, which provides virtually unlimited dynamic range, meaning it prevents audio clipping and eliminates the need for precise gain adjustments whilst recording. So, as you can see, this is a pretty powerful creative tool, but what about the autofocus performance? Because let's face it, if this camera has the ability to lock onto targets as well as Hans Mollman, then all of those fancy tech features are pretty useless, right?
Oh dear. Now you've done it.
Well, just like its little brother, the S5 Mark II, this benefits from a 779-point phase detection autofocus system with all of the AI tracking features you'd expect these days. Now, whilst I can honestly say that during the trip I didn't have any issues at all with this camera and everything seemed to be locking on perfectly well, a handful of other creators were complaining that the focus was somewhat sporadic, particularly when shooting in low light situations. Now, I shot a fair amount of low light images whilst on the trip and I still had no issues, but one of the big benefits of going on trips like this is that when issues arise, we do have access to the engineers who made this, so problems can be looked at and hopefully fixed pretty quickly. And lo and behold, just a few days later, the Panasonic team informed us that they'd identified the bug and supplied us all with a new firmware update, which seems to have fixed the problem for most people. But pre-production bugs aside, whilst I think the AF on this camera is absolutely fine, I still think it's fair to say that Panasonic may have a way to go before they'll be slapping the likes of Sony around in the AF arena. Now don't get me wrong, by no means does this provide a sloppy performance, but even my Sony a7C Mark II, which is now a few years old, just feels a bit more snappy and responsive to me. A small example of this would be when I tested the animal detection AF during a visit to a reindeer sanctuary. Whilst the camera did a pretty good job at picking out the reindeers themselves, most of the time it would focus on the body or whatever part of the animal was closest to the camera at that time, which isn't always the spot you want to lock onto. And it just felt like the feature that was meant to make my life easier was actually just making things a little bit more complicated. So I kept finding myself just switching back to the tried and tested method of using a single AF point and then using the joystick on the back to get the focus where I wanted, and that definitely garnered better results. But based on Panasonic's pretty respectable track record of trying to improve their products with firmware updates, I do have confidence that this will only be improved as time goes on. But anyway, the big question now is, how much does this cost? Well, at launch, the S1R Mark II body only will cost just under $3,300 or around £3,000. And obviously, that is a lot of money for a camera, but when you compare it directly to its closest competition, this is actually between $600 to $1,000 cheaper, which is pretty impressive. So, do I think this is Panasonic's best mirrorless camera to date? Well, actually, yeah, I mean, at the very least, I think it's the most impressive in terms of specs and value for money. So does that mean that I think that everyone should run out and buy one right away? Well, probably not.
Explain yourself.
You see, whilst there's no denying that this is an immensely powerful camera, for the vast majority of people, this is probably going to be total overkill. I mean, hell, I make content for a living, and even I would struggle to find a use for half of the features that it offers, as cool as they might be. For me, if I was going to pick any camera from the Panasonic lineup, I still think that the S5 Mark II is the most sensible option of the lot. And you can even pick one of those up these days for around half the price of what this thing's going to sell for. All of that said, if you happen to be in the market for a high resolution photo and video capture beast, then the Panasonic Lumix S1R Mark II is easily the best bang for buck option currently available.